We're going to turn now to the next topic, and that is wealth management. I'm going to introduce our next speaker, the art of transitioning generational wealth. And I'd like to introduce you all to my son, Jordan. This is the portion of the program he came for. Just kidding. No, my son is here in attendance today. And for that, we have Ray Radigan. I've known Ray for a considerable period of time. He is now the Senior Managing Director at Peapack Private Wealth. And he has spoken at the Intergen a few times before. Prior to Peapack, he held leadership positions at TD Bank and First Republic Bank. He has led business development at all of those endeavors. And I learned last night that Peapack, which was a New Jersey wealth management firm, has moved into New York in a big way, and he can tell you more about that. Ray is a successful person in the financial and wealth planning world, and we're going to let him cheer us all up, Ray, will you?
I'll do my best. All right, thank you, everyone. What I'm going to do today is talk about the art of transitioning generational wealth, all right? And I'm going to basically break this down into three categories. The first category is I'm going to talk about the 7 generations that are out there today. There's 7. And I'm going to talk about their general characteristics and talk about not only how they view life, but how they might approach financial and estate planning. Then what I'm going to do is talk about some estate planning strategies to consider if and when the federal estate tax exemption, in fact, sunsets. All right, we're not sure it's going to happen, but we'll see. All right, we'll talk about these strategies. And then finally, I'll just give a brief summary on the newly public final and proposed regulations on required minimum. Talk about how we can help our clients try to maximize and pass on their retirement assets to the next generation. So a lot to cover. The first, these are the 7 generations that are out there today, okay? You start with the greatest generation, and today, believe it or not, they're anywhere between 7 and 123 years old. Obviously, a diminishing generation, but there's members there nonetheless, okay? And then we get to the silent generation. The silent generation today is anywhere between 79 and 96 years old. Any members of the silent generation with us today? Peter, there you go. And then we get to the baby boomers. I am a proud member of the baby boomers. We as a group today are between 60 and 78 years old. Any baby boomers out there? And we go. All right. Then next we get to Generation X. Generation X today is anywhere between 44 and 59 years old. Any members of Generation X? Okay. And then we get to the millennials. Millennials today are between 28 and 43 years old. The largest part of the workforce right now is this generation, the millennials. Any members of the millennials? Okay, that's what I thought. And then we get to Generation Z, between 12 and 27 years old, just coming into the workforce now. By any chance, any members of Generation Z? There we go. Welcome. And then last but not least is Generation Alpha, newborns to 11 years old. It's a generation in the making, all right? These are the 7 generations that are out there. Let's quickly talk about the greatest generation. The greatest generation is a phrase coined by Tom Brokaw, the former anchor at NBC. And they were basically lived through the Depression, and many of them were veterans of World War II. These guys, as you can see, patriotic, committed, they value honor and trustworthiness. They had a very moralistic attitude towards conflict, meaning World War II. And what their childhood memories were could have been the start of World War I, and it could have also been the crash of '29 and the resulting depression, all right? And the reason I say this, I think childhood memories has a huge impact on each one of us. And I'll get through different generations and the childhood memories that they had, okay? And it has an impact, not only on how they view life, but how they might approach financial and estate planning, okay? Notable members, all right? I can go on for pages, all right? What's interesting is when you get to Dick Van Dyke and then down, they are still alive, all right? Jimmy Carter. Anybody know who Melvin Kaminsky might be? Mel Brooks, okay? I try to use the real names there. These are the notable members of the greatest generation, which gets us to the silent generation. With the silent generation, also known as traditionalists, they too lived through depression, lived through very hard times, especially early in their life. And what does that mean? That they had to endure sacrifice. They are hardworking. I think the biggest attribute for this group is they help rebuild the US economy after World War II, all right? They're respectful, they're loyal, and their childhood memories could include Pearl Harbor, could include the atomic blast in Japan, all right? And again, could have a huge impact on these folks, all right? And these are the notable members of the silent generation. Again, I could go on for pages and pages as to who that might be. Joe Malinsky, anybody know who that is? Just Joan Rivers, all right? Again, I just used the real names. And that gets to the baby boomers. Obviously, that name comes from the fact there was a boom in birth rates after World War II, okay? And what this group is known to be is kind of workaholics. You gotta be careful, you don't wanna over-stereotype, but this group is known to be workaholics, have a very structured life, okay? And we lived through prosperous times in the sense there was no world war, thankfully not yet anyway. But, and the good news about this generation and the previous two generations is they had strong interpersonal skills because they had to. There was no such thing as the internet for many of us, for me, until well into my 30s and 40s, right? So the good news is these older generations have stronger interpersonal skills. I'd say the weakness is we're constantly, I'll speak for myself, trying to catch up with technology, constantly. Childhood memories. Two things I remember when I was 5 years old. I remember the JFK assassination like it was yesterday, all right? 5 years old, I remember the reaction of my kindergarten teacher, the whole 9 yards. And I remember the Beatles on Ed Sullivan. I remember that as well. My mother actually woke me up. I don't know why, but you have to watch this. And I watched it. But we were far from the silent generation. The silent generation kind of went along with the government. You know, we had Woodstock, we had Vietnam, we had the civil rights movement. We were a pretty protesting group, to say the least, all right? That's the baby boomers, all right? The technology people insisted they add my name to this, but it is what it is, okay? By the way, who's Maureen McCormick? I heard Marsha Brady. There we go. Generation X. Generation X is also known as the daycare generation because in many homes, both mom and dad worked. And when they got home from school, right, after sports, social activities, it would be a period of time at home where they're by themselves. And as such, this group tends to be very independent. They love their autonomy. By the way, even though the baby boomers were kind of workaholics, these guys had a much better balance work-life. I love the saying, work smart, not hard. That's what they basically did, all right? Passion for charity, and their childhood memories would include anything from MTV, disco, AIDS, you name it, okay? Notable members of Generation X. I see George Santos there. I'm not sure that's right, but we'll get to him in a second. All right, that gets us to the millennials. Just starting, it's the largest part of the working group right now. Easy. They want their work to be meaningful, all right? And when there's a problem at work, they would rather collaborate and figure out what is the issue versus it being dictated down from top down, okay? They are clearly better in technology than other generations. And you talk about their childhood memory, I'd say the biggest one by far is 9/11, all right? If you're over 30 years old, we remember 9/11. Imagine being 9/11, going through 9/11 and you're 9 years old, 10 years old, huge impact on my kids, all right? And I think that's a childhood memory that they'll never forget, okay? Notable, I see George Santos is there again. I think we asked him the question twice, and it is. All right, that gets us to Generation Z, and there's members here of Generation Z. Clearly more diverse than previous generations, probably more adaptable at technology than previous generations. They are less likely to spend time in the mall, more concerned with climate crisis, and I think their biggest event, childhood memory, would be the pandemic, all right, and COVID, and that sort of thing. And that, in turn, made a huge issue on their mental health, all right? And I think going forward, mental health, especially for the younger generations, is gonna play a huge part in financial planning as well as the state, okay? Notable members of Gen Z, this is just gonna grow over years, all right, just the start. And finally, Generation Alpha, 0 to 11 years old, probably more adept at technology. It's too soon to tell, but I'm assuming that's gonna happen. Probably more diverse than previous generations, so this is still a generation in the making. Those are the 7 generations out there. Now, it's interesting. A question was asked, these different generations, you know, what's your top priority in estate planning? And there were 3 choices. Either, number 1, transfer to the next generation, maintain lifestyle, or improve society. What I find fascinating about this silent generation, 49%, their top priority was maximizing next generation. Look at baby boomers. We're a bunch of selfish you-know-whats. Our priority is 48% lifestyle. I find it interesting. I find the responses to millennials, 48% transfer to the next generation, and the Generation X, Millennial, and Z have a pretty high priority when it comes to social changes, more so than previous generations. Let's put it that way. Then the next question that was asked, well, wasn't broken down by generations, but it was basically, where do you get your financial planning and estate planning advice from? And you can answer more than once. And technology has everything to do with these responses. When you look at over age 43, 77% of them get their advice from professional advisors, all right? Only 47% of the younger gets their advice from financial advisors. And look at the social media. 4% of those basically over 43 get their advice from social media, and yet 31% for those 42 and younger. And technology is going to have a huge impact on financial and estate planning going forward as we move on. All right, couple of interesting facts. In the next 20 years, there's going to be a huge transition of wealth. And it's basically the silent generation and the baby boomers are going to transfer well in excess of $80 trillion to the younger generations. And over time, millennials, you will be the wealthiest generation out there, all right? Due to your advancement in your own careers as well as inheritance from previous generations. Only 45% of baby boomers believe their children are ready for inheritance, all right? We're a tough group. We really are. And we're seeing a lot more trust being created as a result of that, all right? And I think trust will be even more prominent in estate planning going forward than it is today, okay? And then communication, believe it or not, wealthy families are much better at communicating their estate plans than the less wealthy. Something to learn from that. Getting back to Generation Z and the pandemic, 37% of them sought professional help on mental health. That's huge. And I do think mental health is going to play such a prominent role in financial and estate plan going forward. The other thing too, today, there is no question we are in an aging population. There's no question about it, all right? The fastest growing segment of our population by far are those over 85. Fortunately, those over 85, 47% of them have some form of dementia, all right? And I think as we age, you know, dementia has always been a part of our estate planning and financial planning. As we age, I think it will even be more so. all right? So let's just make sure I go back here. Yeah, anyway, so those are the issues. Now what I want to do is talk about what happens if the federal estate tax exemption does in fact sunset, all right? There's a chance it may not. These guys talked about the fiscal consequences if in fact it does sunset. So, but let's assume it might not. So the current and future status of the estate tax exemption is, number one, right now, federal estate tax exemption is $13.61 million, all right? Next year, thanks to inflation, it goes to $13.99 million. Married couple, think about it, can shelter almost $28 million from federal estate tax. The thing is, if there's no new legislation, then January 1st, 2026, basically the federal estate tax exemption will sunset and will probably be cut in half. Probably be somewhere around $7 million. Now, when you think about all this affects about 2% of the population out there. But we all have wealthy clients. And believe me, with the wealthy clients, this could have a huge impact on their financial and estate plans. And I think as advisors, what we have to do is figure out a couple things. Number one, if we have wealthy clients, do they have more than enough assets to give away and still retain enough to comfortably support themselves? That's the first question. And then the second question is, do they want to make gifts? All right, and if the answer is yes on both ends, then as advisors, we have to look at the net worth, figure out what exemptions were previously used, what is their current estate plan, and then when it comes to making gifts, there's three ways to make a gift. You can take advantage of the annual exclusion, right? $18,000, I can give $18,000 a year to as many people as I choose and not incur gift tax. Goes up to times that by 2 for married couples. That's one way to make a gift. Another way to make a gift is pay directly for educational expenses, medical expenses, and third, but not least, is take advantage of the unused exemption. What I want to do is show you financially what the advantages might be, and I'm using a very wealthy couple, all right? I'm assuming we have a couple who have a total estate of $50 million. And what I further assume is they never made any previous gifts, but they make gifts next year, $27.98 million. That's 13.99 times 2. They both die in 2026. What's left in the estate is about $22 million. If legislation doesn't change, and Lou, you pointed this out, the estate tax goes up to 45%, not 40%. So what's the net distribution in this example? A little over $40 million. Compare that if you've had this $50 million couple who does not make a gift next year and dies the year after. What happens there, and let's assume the federal estate tax exemption is $7 million, cut in half. So collectively they can shelter 14, that gets them down to 36 million. Times that by 45%, what's ultimately left here is almost 34 million, $6 million less than we saw in the previous example. So that's how financially it could impact people with regard to the sunset, okay? That's number one. But I think the biggest advantage of making gifts, quite frankly, is the subsequent appreciations kept out of your estate. Huge. And it's funny, I'll use an example. Let's suppose this year, mom takes $10 million, puts it in a trust for the benefit of daughter, and it stays in there for, let's say, 20 years. And let's assume the funds are invested in the S&P index fund for 20 years. I asked the question, what was the annualized rate of return for the S&P 500 for the last 20 years? It's 11.1%. If this appreciates by 11.1% in 20 years, how much is in the trust? $82 million, all right? It's crazy, right? Now look, obviously, I didn't factor in taxes, I didn't factor in distributions. Let's assume it's 50 million, all right? The appreciation is just extraordinary when it comes to lifetime gifts. In terms of strategies, when we work with our clients, I think the first thing we do is when we help them is look at the cost basis of the property, all right? If it's appreciated property, there could be significant capital gains tax down the road, okay? So we look at that. Also, the SLAT, I know, Lou, you're gonna talk about that. It's a great way for a married couple, one spouse, to create a gifted trust for the benefit of the other spouse so that the grantor has indirect access to those funds. So that's a huge situation. I'm in the trust business. Gifts should be made in trust, period. Because you maximize asset protection, and you can draft us in such a way where if it's appropriate to make an outright distribution, you make it, all right? But otherwise, the funds are protected from future creditor claims and all that kind of stuff, all right? And then finally, we see family members creating family endowments for trusts that benefit not only the next generation, but generations beyond that, and also life insurance, all right? We see a lot of use of the irrevocable life insurance trust as a means of keeping death benefits out of an estate. We see that huge with business owners. It gives the estate liquidity to pay the tax and keep the business as a whole. And I've also seen it used to equalize distributions among beneficiaries. Some work in the company, some don't, what have you, all right? And then there's all sorts of strategies that work in a higher or lower interest rate environment. Don't have the time to get into that. So the last part is the required minimum distribution rules. They were published back in July. And what they did is, number one, they confirmed a lot of things that were in the previous proposed regulations, especially dealing with what's known as the 10-year rule and when annual distributions are required. I'll get to that in just a second. But I also think that these new regulations give us more planning options. And we'll talk about that as well. I want to give a shout out to this guy, Jeffrey Levine. His presentation is absolutely phenomenal. More on that. Okay, the first thing that these regulations did is they confirmed the required beginning date. That is the date when you have to start taking out required minimum distributions. And depending on when you were born will be dependent on when your required beginning date might be. For years, the required beginning date was 70 and a half, all right? What the Secure Act did, it recognized that we as a group are living longer, so they pushed back the required beginning date. So if you're born 1960 or later, it's 75 years old. 2 points I want to make about this. Number one, let's suppose you have a client who turned 73 this year, have to start taking out minimum distributions. They can wait until April 1st, the year following, to take out their first distribution. When is the second distribution due? December 31st, the same year. That's 2 distributions the same year. I ordinarily recommend when you hit that required beginning date, start taking out your distributions. So there's one in year 1 and one in year 2, all right? That's number one. Number two, how do you calculate? You know, there's software programs, all sorts of things. If you have a 73-year-old client and they had $1 million IRA at year end the year before, okay, what is this person's required minimum distribution? In 99% of the time, you go to the uniform life table and you say, what is the life expectancy of a 73-year-old? It's 26.5. You take your $1 million, divide it by 26.5, and your minimum distribution is in excess of $37,000. And the following year, you say, what's the life expectancy? 74, and so on. The only time you would not use the uniform life table is if the spouse is the sole beneficiary and they're more than 10 years younger than the owner. Then you use what's known as Table 2. And Table 1 is used to calculate life expectancy for beneficiaries. Okay? What the rules also clarified is what happens if in the year of the owner's death they did not fully take out their required minimum distribution. The best way I can show you how this works is by example. You got a client, and their required minimum distribution for this year is $20,000. They die in June, July, and they only took out 9. Number one, the regulations clarify, and let's assume brother and sister are equal beneficiaries. They have to take out that remaining minimum distribution no later than December 31st following the year of owner's death. That's number one. Number two, this is brand new. Brother and sister choose among themselves who is to take out what. Brother can take out $11,000, sister can take out $11,000, they can split the difference. This flexibility did not exist under prior regulations, all right? Let's keep going. All right, the last topic I'll talk about, and then I'll quickly talk about trust as well. After the owner dies, how long you can stretch out distribution after the owner dies depends on who is the beneficiary. And there's three classes of beneficiaries. The first class is the eligible designated beneficiary. It's the spouse, basically those less than 10 years younger than the owner. It includes disabled or a chronically ill individual. It includes the child, minor child of the owner, all right, or certain trusts for their benefit. This group has the most liberal provisions when it comes to distributions after death. And basically, you can stretch out distributions just as you could before the Secure Act, with one exception. I'll get to that in a second, okay? The second group is the basically non-eligible designated beneficiaries. The most common example would be the adult child, okay? With the adult child, they're subject to the 10-year rule. You're not stretching out distributions over their life expectancy. All funds have to be distributed no later than December 31st following the 10th year of the owner's death, okay? And then the third class of beneficiaries, the non-eligible designated beneficiaries, that's the estate, that's the charity, and they have the most stringent rules with one exception. So really quickly, eligible designated beneficiary. If the owner dies prior to the required beginning date, they die when they're 66 years old, all right? Then what happens is these beneficiaries, if they're eligible beneficiaries, basically they can spread out distributions over their life expectancy or take advantage of the 10-year rule. And if you take advantage of the 10-year rule and the owner died before their required beginning date, there's no annual distributions that are required. Secondly, if the owner dies after the required beginning date, you can either take out distributions on your life expectancy or the owner's life expectancy, whichever's longer, okay? And the spouse, quite frankly, has the most options when it comes. They can roll it over into their own account. They can take advantage of the 10-year rule. They can be eligible beneficiary. What's interesting about the spousal rollover, the regulations clarify that if it's the choice between the 10-year rule and the spousal rollover, there's no time deadline to elect the spousal rollover, all right? The only thing is, use an example. Let's suppose in this example, husband dies basically at age 70 in 2021 and names wife as beneficiary. And wife says, I'm gonna take advantage of the 10-year rule. In 2030, wife says, wait a minute, never mind. I wanna roll over those funds into my IRA. Believe it or not, they can do it. But they have to take hypothetical required minimum distributions first. And in this example, it would start in 2024 through 2030. Take that money out, and then whatever's left is rolled over into the IRA, all right? Minor children. If minor children are named as beneficiary, let's just say mom dies and daughter, 13 years old, is named as a beneficiary. What happens there is daughter, the following year, starts to take out distributions during her life expectancy, and when daughter turns 21, then the 10-year rule applies. And not only do all funds have to come out 10 years, basically when, December 31st when the daughter turns 31, but annual distributions continue to apply. Disabled and chronically ill beneficiaries can also spread out distributions over their life expectancy. The adult child, in a nutshell, what happens here, the 10-year rule applies, but if the owner dies prior to the required beginning date, no annual distributions are required. Here's the big surprise. If the owner dies after the required beginning date, these adult children not only are subject to the 10-year rule, they have to take out annual distributions years 1 through 9. This was a big surprise. This first came out in the proposed regulation. It took the world by surprise. And most people who fit into this category didn't take out required minimum distributions on an annual basis, all right? And I have an example that goes through this. Bottom line is this. The regulations say, all right, if you didn't take out annual distributions and you fit into this, you don't have to take them out 21, 22, 23, 24, and there's no penalties. But you have to start taking them out in 2025, and the 10-year rule still applies, okay? Last but not least, by the way, if I was to talk about the RMD rules for successor beneficiaries, we'd be here up until about 9:30 tonight. It's crazy. What this is a great flow chart as to what happens depending on certain situations. And also these slides spell it out as well. Finally, you can name trusts as beneficiaries, and the key point there with trusts is you want to create what's known as a see-through trust so that the beneficiaries are identifiable and countable for required minimum distribution rule purposes. There's two types of see-through trusts, the conduit trust and the accumulation trust. And again, I do have examples here, but basically, if you name eligible designated beneficiaries as the current beneficiaries of a conduit trust, you can spread out distributions over their life expectancy, all right? And then finally, there's the accumulation trust. They're mostly subject to the 10-year rule with one exception. If the current beneficiary is either a disabled or chronically ill beneficiary, even though it's an accumulation trust, you can spread out distributions over their life expectancy. And that has to do with preserving Medicaid and preserving government benefits. Because if I'm forced to make out distribution to a disabled child, it could jeopardize their Medicaid eligibility. All right, this stuff was riveting, it was fascinating. Guys, thanks for your attention, truly appreciate it.
Thank you, Ray.